The Nature of Women, Part 2, Vanity and the Need for Approval. Source: Old Miscellaneous Parable Sutra 18. Once upon a time, in ancient days, there was an era when the relationship between men and women determined the fate of kingdoms. This story is about a king with strict rules for women in a certain country of that era, his beautiful wife, the queen, and their wise son, the prince. In this country, the roles and relationships between men and women were strictly defined. At the same time, it created questions and conflicts in their hearts. The queen's yearning for the outside world, the prince's pursuit of understanding women, and the king's decision. The story woven by these elements poses deep insights into the essence of men and women. How understanding and empathy are born, and how misunderstandings and prejudices are overcome. We are now about to embark on a journey to find those answers. Long ago, in a certain country, there was a king who was very strict towards women. This king was known for his coldness, and his laws were strictly enforced throughout the country. This strictness applied equally to his wife, the queen, who lived under the king's rigid rules. Within the luxurious layout of the palace, the queen often felt lonely and questioned her position. She held deep respect and love for the king, but at the same time, she was pained by his lack of understanding. One day she called her son, the prince, to her room and said,
"Despite being the king's consort, I have never once toured to see the real conditions of the country. How important it is for me to see the lives of the people with my own eyes and hear their voices directly. You understand this too, don't you? I would like to walk in the world outside the palace just once. But the king never allows it. You have your father's trust and are persuasive. Could you also convey my small wish to the king and support me? As the queen of the country and as a woman, I believe I have a role to play as part of this nation."
The queen's voice was plaintive and her eyes were moist. She had always showered her son with deep affection, and the prince, in turn, held deep respect and love for his mother. The prince, pained by his mother's words, decided to fulfill her wish. As the queen asked repeatedly, the prince conveyed his mother's wishes to the king and spoke in her favor. The king initially showed reluctance, but finally gave permission due to the prince's earnest persuasion. However, there was one condition.
"Prince, you must go with her."
It was that the prince himself would accompany her. So, the prince decided to become the driver of the queen's carriage himself. He wanted to protect his mother's safety while giving her the freedom she desired.
"It's for my mother's sake. I must do at least this much."
Finally, on the day of the visit, the palace gates opened, and a luxurious carriage carrying the queen and the prince slowly moved out onto the main street of the capital. The carriage was adorned with gold and jewels, its brilliance dazzling even from afar. The horses pulling the carriage were beautifully groomed, their manes flowing in the wind. The prince, while driving the carriage as the coachman, felt joy in being able to fulfill his mother's wish. As the procession moved along the main street, the roadside was quickly filled with people gathered to catch a glimpse of the queen. People from various classes, from nobles to commoners, gathered, and children could be seen among them. They were waving their hands excitedly and raising their voices. As the carriage came before them, people bowed respectfully and praised the queen's beauty. The queen watched the people lining the road through the carriage curtain, but soon a change occurred in her heart.
Are these crowds perhaps gathered for me? What an experience this is. It feels so good. If this is the case, perhaps we should have announced it beforehand and gathered even more people.
She was moved by the people's praise and felt surprise and joy at being so acclaimed. And without thinking, she lifted the curtain to make her face more visible to the crowd. As her beautiful face appeared, the crowd was even more captivated by her beauty and raised their voices in praise. Seeing this behavior of the queen, the prince was enveloped in complex emotions. He felt relieved to see his mother's happy expression, but at the same time, he questioned in his heart whether even the queen could be so fragile in the face of female vanity.
What a thing.
Unable to bear driving the carriage any further, the prince suddenly decided to return to the castle, pretending to have a stomach ache.
Mother, I'm feeling a bit unwell in my stomach, so we'll return to the castle immediately.
He carefully began to turn the carriage back, saying nothing more to the queen, and simply fulfilled his role as the driver quietly. As the carriage turned back towards the castle, the atmosphere inside changed completely. The glow from earlier disappeared from the queen's face, replaced by a flicker of disappointment. She gazed out the window, letting out a deep sigh. The outside scenery gradually gave way to the palace walls, and the queen quietly watched this change. In the returning carriage, the queen murmured with apparent regret,
To think we have to return already, when we finally left the castle. I've never looked forward to anything as much as seeing the outside world with my own eyes. But if your stomach is unwell, it can't be helped. If you were really unwell, you shouldn't have forced yourself to be the driver for my sake. Your health is the most important thing. It's just a little disappointing. I was hoping that by touching the outside world, I might make some new discoveries. But your health comes first, so let's wait for another opportunity. Ah, what a pity, what a pity. If your stomach hurts, there's nothing we can do, I suppose.
she said. Her words conveyed both concern for her son and a strong desire to see more of the outside world. That night, the prince couldn't sleep, tormented by the thoughts swirling in his mind. Quiet moonlight streamed through the window of his room, illuminating his contemplation.
Even my mother, who is the queen, was captivated by people's praise. She behaved as if showing off her own appearance. My mother has always acted as a symbol of dignity and compassion. Her behavior today shook my image of her. If my mother, despite her position, can be moved by vanity, how easily must ordinary women be influenced by the outside world? This gave me an opportunity to think deeply about the nature of women and the understanding we should have towards them. The hearts of women are complex and often beyond our imagination. My mother's actions made me acutely aware of this fact.
He muttered to himself. He was deeply disappointed by the manifestation of his mother's vanity and began to seek a new understanding of women. Thinking this way, he couldn't stay still. The prince quietly slipped out of his room and went into the mountains beyond the palace garden. Under the moonlight, after walking for a while, he came upon a large Nyagroda tree. Near the base of the tree, a clear spring was bubbling up, its pure water sound cutting through the night's silence. The prince casually climbed this large tree and looked around from above. On top of the Nyagroda tree by the spring, the prince explored his own heart and deeply pondered the essence of women. Then a Brahmin monk appeared out of nowhere. The monk quietly bathed in the spring water, and his actions caught the prince's interest. The presence of the monk would add a new dimension to the prince's thoughts. Sitting quietly atop the Nyagroda tree, meditating in the moonlight, the prince was captivated by the Brahmin monk's calm movements. The monk came to the spring and, as if performing an ancient ritual, carefully removed his robes and began to cleanse himself with the pure spring water. His figure looked like a prayer in the silence. Having thoroughly washed and cleansed his body and put on his robes, the Brahmin monk sat at the base of the tree and began to eat quietly, as if in meditation. His meal was simple, exuding a calm atmosphere that seemed in harmony with nature. Under the moonlight, his figure appeared even more mysterious. Watching this scene from atop the tree with bated breath, many questions arose in the prince's mind.
Where did this monk come from? What meaning is there in his actions?
The prince watched quietly, turning thoughts over in his mind. After finishing his meal, the Brahmin monk suddenly used a technique to produce an earthen-colored jar. The jar had an aged appearance, looking as if it had passed through centuries of time. Unable to contain his curiosity, the prince watched intently. When the monk opened the lid of the jar, a woman suddenly appeared from within. She was beautiful, and her figure appeared even more mysterious in the moonlight. The Brahmin monk, together with the woman, set up something like a screen on the grass by the spring, and the two disappeared behind it. The prince was astonished at this strange occurrence and doubted his eyes. He carefully gripped the tree branch while keeping his eyes fixed on this mysterious scene. In the increasingly bright moonlight, the behavior of the Brahmin monk and the mysterious woman was beyond the prince's imagination.
This is the union of man and woman?
The two spent time quietly behind the screen, with a sacred atmosphere surrounding them. The prince, while fascinated by this scene, felt complex emotions of confusion and curiosity intertwining. After a while, as the Brahmin monk began to snore beside the woman, she in turn used a technique to produce another jar. This jar was different from the previous one, exuding an even older and more mysterious atmosphere. She carefully opened the lid of the jar and summoned a young man from within. The prince was even more astonished at the appearance of this young man.
No way! No way! No way!
She and the young man lay down together in a nearby patch of grass, spending a secret time under the moonlight. The woman and the young man embraced for a while, but soon the woman got up and put the man back into the jar she had brought out earlier. Her movements were careful, yet seemed to possess some inexplicable power. She swallowed the jar and returned to lie down beside the Brahmin monk, falling asleep. The prince had been watching this entire sequence intently. His mind was full of questions and astonishment. This inexplicable event made his understanding of women even more complex. He tried to understand the meaning of what he had witnessed, but answers were not easily found. After a while, breaking the silence, the Brahmin monk woke up. He hid the sleeping woman in the jar, swallowed the jar, and produced a staff. And with that staff in hand, he departed into the moonlight, heading somewhere unknown. The next day, unable to forget the strange events, the prince told the king everything. The king showed interest in his son's story and decided to see for himself. In the evening, the king had his retainers bring food for 3 people and headed towards the mountain with the Nyagroda tree, accompanied by the prince. The two had steeled themselves, determined to be witnesses to whatever might happen. The king and prince had the food for 3 placed at the base of the tree and hid in the shadows. As twilight fell, the forest was illuminated by moonlight, deepening its mysterious atmosphere. The two held their breath, waiting for the Brahmin monk to appear. Soon, as if breaking the night silence, the Brahmin monk appeared. He cleansed his body with the spring water and donned his robes, just as he had the night before. Then he sat at the base of the large tree and quietly began to eat. At that moment, noticing the food for 3 prepared at the base of the tree, he said with puzzlement,
"But I'm alone."
As if in response to those words, the prince suddenly spoke from the shadows of the tree.
Didn't you have dinner with your wife at the base of this tree last night?
The Brahmin monk was surprised and flustered, but unable to leave now. He chanted a spell and produced the jar.
Oh, I see, so you saw my wife.
And he summoned the woman and had her sit beside him.
I wonder who the 3rd portion is for?
As the Brahmin monk muttered, the prince immediately said to the woman who had just appeared,
Didn't you have dinner with a young man last night? Am I wrong? No, not dinner. It was the union of man and woman, wasn't it?
The woman silently stared back at the prince, but when he said the same thing 3 times. She reluctantly produced a jar, summoned the young man, and they began to eat together. Thus the 3 finished their meal and departed to somewhere unknown. The king and prince had been watching this entire sequence intently. Only the black shadow of the Nyagroda tree was cast on the spring water in the moonlight. After the Brahmin monk and his strange companions disappeared into the forest, with the moonlight faintly illuminating the woods, the king and prince remained silent for a while. The surroundings were enveloped in silence, with the large shadow of the Niagrota tree reflected in the spring. The prince, deep in thought, turned to face his father, the king.
I haven't yet heard why you came to such a place.
The king quietly asked. The prince answered calmly, but with a firm voice.
Yes, just as that Brahmin monk brought out the woman from the jar, I too have hidden thoughts in my heart. Now is the time to speak of the concerns I've kept hidden inside all this time. Mother's behavior and the mysterious events we witnessed have deeply affected my heart. They made me think deeply about the nature of women and the understanding we should have towards them. What I felt through these events, and about our thoughts towards the women of our country. I feel it's time to have a sincere discussion with you, Father.
The prince told about how that night, the queen had lifted the curtain with her hand in front of the crowd lining the road, showing her face as if to say, "Look at me."
Last night, I learned from atop this tree how fickle women can be, not just limited to my mother. Please forgive me, Father, for leaving the castle without permission.
The prince stated. The king listened carefully to his son's words and nodded deeply. Then, the king immediately returned to the castle and conveyed an imperial order to his ministers. The king ordered to strengthen the discipline for women throughout the country even more than before. At the same time, he also preached the importance of respecting and understanding women to men. However, it is said that women continued to trouble men as always, even after that. Rumors of this event spread throughout the country, and people praised the prince's wisdom and the king's generosity. The prince continued his journey to understand the hearts of women. Eventually, his wisdom and compassion spread to all the people in the country he ruled. The events under the Niagrota tree became a profound lesson for them. It brought new insights and compassion in governing the country. This story provides us with several important lessons from the perspective of men and women. The first is the danger of vanity. The scene where the queen is captivated by the crowd's praise demonstrates the danger of vanity. It's a warning that depending on others' evaluations can cloud one's essential value and self-awareness. The second is the importance of understanding and empathy. The prince strives to deepen his understanding of his mother's and other women's behavior. This suggests the importance of mutual understanding and empathy between men and women. The effort to understand the other's position and feelings is essential for building better relationships. The third is the impact of individual actions. The impact of the queen's actions on the prince shows the significant influence that an individual's actions can have on those around them, especially close ones. It's important to recognize that our actions can have unexpected effects. The fourth is social norms and individual freedom. At the end of the story, although the king strengthens the discipline for women, the conclusion that women continue to walk their own path highlights the complex relationship between social norms and individual freedom. The fifth is the diversity and complexity of men and women. Throughout the story, men and women express their emotions in different ways and are depicted as taking different actions. This teaches us that people are diverse and complex beings, regardless of gender. Overall, this story provides an opportunity to consider mutual understanding between men and women, individual self-awareness, and the balance between social norms and individual freedom.